Hello, everyone. Quick cold open here because we got some news this afternoon that came after we had actually recorded last night. It seems as if we found over the course of the last couple of years that every time we have a podcast and we're just about to release it, or even after we release it, there always ends up being some sort of news. And so after we recorded last night, but just before we could release this week's podcast, we found out about 4 o'clock Eastern this afternoon that the Boston Marathon is going to be a virtual race for 2020. The BAA made that announcement on Facebook, on Instagram, and Twitter, and they sent an email to all of the registered participants for the Boston 2020 Marathon. Now, you'll recall, originally, of course, it was supposed to be on April 20th. They put it off till September 14th, but a lot of folks, notably Michelle, thought that there was really no way it was probably going to happen on September 14th either. Well, it's not, but they made it into a virtual race. Now, that's an important distinction here. They didn't cancel the race. They made it into a virtual race. And what that means is that anybody who's an entrant in 2020 will not be able to defer to 2021. Now, they've said that anybody who is in the 2020 race can do the virtual race, or they can get a full refund. And they've also said that there's a qualifying window for the 2021 race is broader for the 2020 entrants. Specifically, they've said that anybody that used a time to get into the 2020 race, they can use that same time to get into the 2021 race. However, that's not a guaranteed entry. Still some unanswered questions about this that hopefully will be cleared up over the course of the next week or so before we record again, such as, will this broadened qualifying window account for everyone, or is the broadened qualifying window just going to be for people who were entered in 2020? I also wonder, just based on what happened with the Tokyo Marathon earlier this year, whether they're going to tweak and change a few things based on the feedback that they get from their entrants. We'll find out. It seems as their plan's a little bit more buttoned up, but I guess we'll see. So did want to make sure we mention that. Lots more to come on this next time that Michelle and Patrick are on the podcast with me. It won't be our next episode, but it'll probably be towards the end of next week. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. That being said, thanks for the cold open. Let's get on with our previously recorded podcast. Welcome back to the Most Pleasant Exhaustion podcast, brought to you by ITL Coaching and Performance, Blue Pineapple Travel, and SlayRX. My name is George Darden. I'm an endurance athlete and coach here in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a father of twin boys. I am a college professor, and I've been doing this endurance sports thing for about 30 years now. I am also by myself on tonight's podcast. Patrick and Michelle, my partners who I appreciate, are taking a couple of weeks off. It's actually not going to be for a little while that they're going to be back here. Tonight I'm going to be by myself, so this will be a short one, even though I am going to bring on a guest here in just a little while, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes when he comes on. But next week is going to be the indoor cycling podcast, which I dare say I've probably put more research in for this indoor cycling podcast than I put in for any other thing in my life, save my dissertation. Hours upon hours that I and 2 other people, Ben Holliday, who's been on the podcast before, and Chrissy Blaisdell-Euler, who has not, but is a marathoner, is an Ironman, and is a bike racer. 3 of us have spent all sorts of time on different platforms, trying them out and seeing which ones we like best, and figuring out the various pros and cons of all the different indoor cycling platforms. We're getting together next week, and we're going to be talking about all of those things. And so I'm really, really excited to share that with you next week. And then come 2 weeks, that's when Patrick and Michelle are going to be back. So that's like the middle of the week, 2 weeks from now. So it's like the 10th of June, around there. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the book at that point. Now, if you missed the podcast last week, or if you missed it a couple of weeks ago, we are doing a summer book group here. We're going to be doing The Happy Runner by Megan and David Roach. If you haven't gotten it, go ahead and get it. I'm not going to talk too much about it tonight, but I did get it last week and I did start reading it. I will say this, and I'm not saying this to turn anybody off. I'm saying this to encourage you if you started it and you feel the way that I do. If you started it and you're kind of like, you know what, I don't really know about this, it doesn't really seem like my style of thing, I kind of feel that way too, actually. I think there's a lot of things inside of this book that are valuable that I'm going to get something from, but the feel and the style of the writers it's just not the way that I would do it. And so I'm really excited to talk more about that in about 2 weeks with Patrick and with Michelle. We're not going to go all the way into it in 2 weeks. We're going to do that in about 4 weeks, sometime around like the 24th of June, towards the end of June there. And then hopefully we'll choose a second book that day, and then we'll talk about that in the very beginning of August. But do make sure you make some progress, because we're going to do a real bona fide check-in there in a couple of weeks. And like I said, after reading the introduction, some things about it I'm not all that fired up about, but there are aspects of it I think that I'm going to really enjoy, and I think there's definitely going to be something I can take from the book The Happy Runner by Megan and David Roach. So do make sure you check it out and join with us in reading it here. I just wanted to give a couple of quick updates tonight to talk about, first, those programming things that are coming up. Secondly, no sooner had we talked about Everesting last week, and we talked about Phil Gaimon and how he went out and he did the fastest Everesting of all time. 4 days after Phil Gaimon did 7 hours and 52 minutes for Everesting, his record was broken by a pro mountain biker named Keegan Swenson. Keegan Swenson. Keegan Swenson went out on Friday, May 15th, and did 7 hours, 40 minutes, and 5 seconds. So beat Phil Gaimon's time by about 12 minutes here. I mention it in part because I'm retconning the podcast we had a couple of weeks ago, or a week ago, where we talked about Phil Gaimon and what he had done here. And 4 days later, right after we released the podcast, that record was broken. So I do obviously want to address that. But at the same time, I also think it speaks to how into Everesting people are right now. Before Phil Gaimon, the record holder was a guy named Tobias Lestrell, who did 8:46. And so that was in 2017. And so over the course of a week, an hour was taken off of the fastest ever time for Everesting. Now, remember, Everesting is when you get on a bike and you go up and down a hill, and you go up and down a hill enough times that eventually you've got 29,029 feet of elevation gain. He did it, Keegan Swenson did it at Pine Canyon Road in Wasatch Mountain State Park. It's near Heber City, Utah, and that's evidently where he lives. It was only a 1.82 mile segment of road. And so just like Phil Gaimon, who went up and down like 70 times on this little small segment of road he did, Keegan Swenson went up and down this 1.82 mile segment of road. It averaged 11%. His maxed out at almost 23%, 22.9% was the maximum gradient on that. So a really, really steep section that he had there. Each hill that he did had an overall elevation gain of just over 1,000 feet, about 1,023 feet. And so he did it 29 times total. He eventually finished with a 104.5 mile ride, and he had a total elevation gain of 29,000 feet, 29,680 feet. So he gave himself a little bit of space there to ensure that he had, in fact, gotten the 29,029 feet. So his power was comparable to Gaimon's, and he was actually doing it to raise money for the MS Society. His dad has MS and was diagnosed with it back in like 2012, 2013. And so he was raising money for that. So by all means, find Keegan Swenson, the pro mountain biker, on Instagram, and check out the photos that he posted from there. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was the first part of the Lance documentary, the 30 for 30 documentary that was on ESPN just this past weekend. It's a 2-part documentary, and each part, I didn't realize this, is 2 hours apiece. And so the first one here took us through his upbringing, his childhood, his getting into endurance sports, his being a triathlete first, and then he got on a bike, and then, of course, he became a cyclist, and all the way through his first Tour de France win. And so it went all the way through his becoming a pro, his world championship win in 1993, his cancer diagnosis, his treatment for that, his, I don't want to say his recovery from cancer, but his coming out the other side of his cancer treatment, and then ultimately his going on to win the first Tour de France of 7. And that's where it stopped. It was great. I enjoyed it. I thought it was very good. He was very open and very candid, which I expected. Anybody who's been following Lance Armstrong over the course of the past several years knows that he has a great deal of candor. It ended, however, with his first Tour win. And I feel like his life changed a lot with each individual Tour win. And so he eventually got divorced. By the time he got that last Tour, and he was dating Sheryl Crow, and he was kind of a rock star and just was a much different character by that time. And so I saw an interview with the director where she said that Lance actually didn't like it. And
I didn't see anything in this first half that I feel like he would have disliked. And so we'll kind of see what ends up coming up here in the second half. But an example of the candor, they asked him right after, they said, how long after you came back from cancer did you start doping in? He was like, oh, immediately. And I think it would have been like, pretty easy for him to say, well, we were kind of cautious. He was like, no, immediately. We did it immediately. And they even asked, they said, do you think your cancer had anything to do with the doping that you did? And he said, that's a good question. I've thought about that a lot, and I just don't know the answer to that. He said, it could be. He said, I thought that maybe human growth hormone that I took prior to my cancer diagnosis, that helps things grow inside your body, and maybe that helps some bad things grow inside my body that I didn't want to grow. He said, but I really don't know the answer to that question. He said, but when I did come back and I started doping again during my comeback, I never used human growth hormone again because I wondered about that. That's just a very candid answer. And it's not something that he necessarily had to answer so candidly. I think also, though, you can see one of the reasons why some people might not totally understand where he's coming from. Literally in the very opening, they said, how young were you when you started doping? And he said, it depends on how you define doping. And I understand what he's saying there as somebody who understands WADA rules. He says it depends on how you define doping. He says some people will say that any sort of injection is doping. And according to WADA rules today, you can't get an injection. And so if you get an injection of something, even if it's like something completely innocuous, if it's not for a legitimate medical purpose, that's actually considered doping. And so he said, so if you considered that to be doping, it started, pretty early on when they were giving us vitamins and all that sort of thing. He says, it wasn't until I was about age 21 that they actually started giving us performance enhancers and all that sort of thing. But again, very candid about that. And I can see how some people might think he's splitting hairs, but I actually don't think he was splitting hairs about that. I think he's giving a much more precise and much more thorough answer. And that's part of him being very open and very candid here. A few other interesting points arose. One is, and you always hear this, how much drugs have always been a part of cycling history and culture. That really comes through here. I was struck by the fact that Lance Armstrong was actually introduced to Michele Ferrari, who is this nowadays disgraced doctor and trainer who used to train cyclists and used to cycle them on and off of performance-enhancing drugs. He was actually introduced to Michele Ferrari by Eddie Merckx. Eddie Merckx, whose picture is right there, and who's generally considered to be the best cyclist of all time. Eddie Merckx had sent his son, Axel Merckx, who still works in pro cycling now as a manager, to Michele Ferrari. And Lance Armstrong said, well, can you introduce me to Michele Ferrari as well? Eddie Merckx said he would, and that's how Lance actually started using EPO, which was the mega drug that pervaded the peloton in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The other thing that I thought was very interesting, another super interesting point from the first one, came from a guy named Michael Rasmussen. And he was interviewed for about 5 seconds, or they only showed about 5 seconds of an interview with him. And he's this Danish guy who he used to be really well known for he didn't like having any weight on his bicycle. He would only carry one bottle at a time. He refused to wear a Livestrong bracelet when they were so popular because he thought it was going to weight him down on the climbs. But he was a super skinny, very powerful mountain climber. And he won the mountains jersey in the Tour de France. But anyway, they were interviewing him and they were talking all about how dangerous cycling is. And one of the reasons why people always cite doping and why doping is a bad thing and the reason why doping shouldn't happen and the reason why it should be illegal is because it harms the people who dope. It's dangerous. It can cause long-term health defects in the people who actually use performance-enhancing drugs. And so if you want to compete in cycling or in track and field or in some other endurance sport, you shouldn't have to risk that sort of danger to your well-being in order to compete by doping. And so if we get those doping out of sport, then that way you can compete for titles and championships safely. Michael Rasmussen pointed out that cycling is a super dangerous sport. They go downhill at 60 miles an hour on these little bitty thin tires on these small bikes, wearing virtually nothing here. They're risking their lives virtually every day. And so this idea that, well, cyclists shouldn't risk their health by doping, like you're harming yourself. He said that argument completely falls flat, given how dangerous cycling actually is. And I thought that was a really interesting point. And I think that it definitely changes the way I think about some of the arguments around doping in cycling. Doesn't mean that I think doping in cycling is okay, but it does mean that when I think about, okay, why is it that we think cycling should not have doping? Well, that whole thing that, well, it's dangerous to the people who compete. Well, that's not really a great argument, given that we expect them to do really dangerous things and really life-risking things as just part of the sport, going downhill in the group, in the rain at 60 miles an hour. So it's worthwhile to think about. It's something I'm going to continue chewing on for the next little while here. One last thing before I bring on our guest and I talk about the thing that's bringing us joy. I do want to point out that next Wednesday, June 3rd, is Global Running Day. And so get out and do a run on that day, do some sort of special challenge, something else like that. If you don't want to run or can't run, or you have some sort of injury, something like that, pick up a copy of Happy Runner by Megan and David Roach and check that out. All right. I'm going to go to the waiting room here, and I'm going to admit the person who's currently waiting in the waiting room, and hopefully he will pop up on the screen. Here he comes. There he is. It is Candler Budd, my cousin, the best man at my wedding. How you doing, cuz?
Cousin George. Thanks for having me.
So I'm glad
this
you're
is
here,
awesome.
Man. So I'm glad you're here. You're doing us a favor, not only by coming on the podcast and talking to us about your new podcast, which is the thing that's bringing me joy, which I'll tell you about here in just a second. But also you're helping us test the whole call-in process, because I'm thinking about having a call-in show later on this summer. What do you think about that?
I love it. So should I pretend like I'm calling in asking a question?
With all those endurance sports you do?
Yes, Dr. Darden, I feel a pain in my pelvic muscles when I run. I don't know. I'm running out of ideas, but
I do appreciate you calling me Dr. Darden.
Yes,
that's a level of respect I'm not accustomed to getting from my co-host on this podcast, guys.
It is well deserved.
So every week on our podcast here, Candler, over the course of the last short while, given the fact that there's lots of not joyful things in the world, we've been talking about things that bring us joy in the world. And so we've talked about YouTube videos that we've watched, or we've talked about different books that we've read, or some piece of news or something else like that, either a new thing or an old thing that's brought us joy. And it dawned on me, literally as I was setting up this podcast, I was like, I should have told Candler to think of something that's bringing him joy. And so if you can have a double track mind and come up with something here in just a minute, that would be super cool. But the thing that's bringing me joy this week is Grab the Remote with Brian and Candler, your new video podcast.
I'm so proud of it. I love it. And I'm working on doing a pause between grab and the, so it's Grab the Remote with Brian and Candler. Brian Chapman, my co-host, we have been friends for about 20 years. And we just have these phone conversations where there was one or two times where I felt bad. I was driving home, because you don't want to walk into your house and with your kids there and be on the phone. Mm-hmm. But there was once or twice where I drove around the circle just so I could finish the conversation. Those are the types of conversations that we have. And it's 90% of it is fun. Mostly we talk about film, and we've been saying for years, we need to put this bad boy on a podcast. And then the pandemic happened and Zoom happened. And I said, well, let's do this. It's now or never. And we have shot 12 episodes and it has been just a blast. So that, George, is one thing that's bringing me joy. But I think another thing that's really bringing me joy is my 5-year-old daughter lost a tooth and learned to ride a bike this week.
Oh, learn to ride a bike. Nice. All right. So it's funny you say learn to ride a bike. Michelle, who is one of our co-hosts, last week, her daughter, who is 5 years old, learned to ride a bike.
Excellent.
So that just ratchets up the pressure on my 2 6-year-olds that much more. Or on the father of the 6-year-olds to try and make sure that they're able to ride the bikes by the end of the summer. But that's super cool. I'm glad you mentioned that. All right, let's talk about your podcast just a little bit more here. So Grab the Remote. I've watched 2 of the episodes. You said you recorded 12?
12.
But not all 12 are available yet, right?
Right. We have 4 that are out right now on YouTube. They're going out on Facebook. Of course, you could see the link on YouTube on Facebook, but we're putting them out on Facebook tomorrow, as well as on Soundcloud on various platforms in audio form. The audio forms, the 11 episodes should be out probably tomorrow. But as far as the video form, where you could see my face, is we have 4 right now. But it is a lot of fun. We tackled the Rocky saga, the Star Wars saga, the Back to the Future trilogy. We have an episode on horror films, comic book movies. There's so much that talking about things that bring me joy. I mean, you think back, a lot of these films, these are films I saw when I was, 7, 10, 13. So not only am I thinking about the films, I'm thinking about what was going on in my life. And we both kind of approach that as well. So there's some human stories involved with it as well.
Right on. So we kind of buried the lead a little bit. So it's Grab the Remote, as you can imagine, is all about movies. And we should say also, you are an actor and you were a theater teacher at the Heritage School in Noonan, Georgia, on the South Side. So I was joking with my wife. Actually, I don't know Brian, and my wife was like, "You think you know all your cousin's friends?" I was like, "I know most of them." But I don't know Brian. So how did y'all meet each other, and what's his background? And was I fair with your biography?
You were fair with my biography. He graduated 2 years before I did, but I got to know him through mutual friends, and he was just one of those friends that we would reconnect every now and then. We had an ongoing joke whenever one of the Star Wars movies would come out, because I always had his cell phone. I would call him and he would answer, and I'm like, "Hey, Brian, do you see me? Where?" It's like knowing he was at the movie, and I would convince him that I was there waving at him, but of course I wasn't. But he performed for many years professionally as an improviser at the Whole World Theater. He is just one of my favorite people. He reminds me a lot of you. He's a wonderful conversationalist. He's a wonderful dad, wonderful husband. He's someone I admire. And not only are you going to hear a lot about film in our podcast, but I think a lot of the give and take with the two of us, the side streets we sometimes go on, the tangents are a lot of fun as well.
Right on. Very good. So I like I said, I've watched two. I watched your recommendations for movies to watch while you're locked down in your house, which was good. And actually, you talk about memories. There's a couple of memories of that last choice that you made. I'm not going to spoil it for anybody here. The last choice you made, I was like, oh yeah, I was part of some of those watching parties you talked about for sure. And then I watched your one today about Return of the Jedi.
You were.
So I feel like I should have gone back and watched your one about Star Wars, or New Hope and Empire Strikes Back before I watched the one about Return of the Jedi today. I didn't do that, and so I'm going to be a little bit out of order, but I think that's okay. But I very much enjoyed the one about Return of the Jedi. I will tell y'all two things. Number one, and this is particularly true in the movies you should watch while on lockdown. Both of you have a level of encyclopedic knowledge where you connect movies in different ways. Like, oh, this actor was also the actor in this other movie, and that's where they starred with this other person who is the brother of this other person, which is just kind of fun and interesting, and I appreciate that. The other thing is that you see things in movies, and Brian's the same way. You see things in movies that I don't see. Because of your background, you watch movies in different ways than I do, and that's cool. And so I always feel as if I learn something from listening to you talk about movies and films and theater that I didn't know. And I consider myself somebody who brings something to the viewing, so I tend to be thoughtful and reflective about the viewing, but you just see it with different eyes. And I feel as if I always learn something by listening to your reflections on a piece of art. So thanks for that, man.
One thing. No, and thank you for saying that. One thing I hope we get across, and Brian and I have never really discussed this, but is even if we're talking about a film that maybe we didn't like or I didn't like or whatever, I hope that the love always comes across, because even if it's the worst film, like this shot that I'm doing right here, it's still not quite right. Oh, wait, I'm covering my mirror. It is, making film is very difficult. There's so much that goes into it. So even if I'm criticizing a film, I hope the love comes across. Also, it is a podcast you could listen to while the kids are in the background. There are so many YouTubers podcasts that I love to listen to, but they drop an F-bomb every other 2 seconds. I'm like, I can't listen to it right now.
Yeah.
So
I try to avoid it. Every now and then I'll drop one and I'll get like 4 texts.
Dirty language.
So yeah. I did. So since we've been filming here on Zoom, I have been putting posters over the door there. And I alternate the poster that I put on the door.
Yes.
And as you can see, I chose to put my Rocky poster on the door tonight. In my workout room, you can see behind me here where we're filming, I have various people that inspire me when I'm on my bike or when I'm on the treadmill, that sort of thing. So you have Emil Zatopek right there. You have Kenenisa Bekele, Mo Farah, and Haile Gebrselassie here. You have Steve Prefontaine here. You have Muhammad Ali there. You have Meb Keflezighi over there in the corner you can't quite see. You have Elliot Kipchoge here, and you have Eddie Merckx up there.
I love it.
Of all those people I just named, how many of them have you ever heard of?
Just a few. 1, 2.
All right.
I did that. Hey, yeah, awesome.
But then around the rest of the room, I have like posters of different races that I've run. And so the Rocky poster is an homage to my having run the Philadelphia Marathon. So rather than putting up a Philadelphia Marathon poster or something from Philadelphia, I put up a Rocky poster, which I think is kind of fun.
It's funny you said that. I thought, wow, there should be pictures of him behind him, but then I thought, no, wait, there shouldn't be. He should have other people behind him.
Absolutely. No, it's much more inspirational to see people that are much faster than I am on the walls that have accomplished much more than I have, for sure. So the only other thing I was going to say too is you and I have talked, and I thought about this when I just pointed out Steve Prefontaine right here, but you and I have talked about me coming on your podcast and what could possibly be, and I was like, ooh, I can talk about Rocky. They already got one. That's cool though. You already had a Rocky one. I was thinking, if you need somebody to come on and talk about which of the 2 Prefontaine movies that came out at the same time, Without Limit starring Billy Crudup or Prefontaine starring future Academy Award-winning Jared Leto, which one was better? I'm more than happy to come on and talk to you about that. I'm sure that would just completely...
A Prefontaine double feature. I love it. We got to get you on. Do you have like a favorite, not to put you on the spot, but do you have a favorite movie from the 80s?
Oh, favorite movie from the 80s. Yeah, you totally put me on the spot. I'd have to think about it for a little while. I have a favorite movie from the 90s.
Tell me.
Can't Hardly Wait.
Ah, nice. That's a good one.
Yeah, but and that goes along with like Shawshank Redemption and Pulp Fiction. And there's a couple of other like favorite movies in the 90s as well. But if you ask me which one I've probably seen the most, I've like watched over and over, and I still just derive a great deal of enjoyment from, Can't Hardly Wait. Yeah.
I don't think I knew that, or I knew that and I forgot that.
It came out on Netflix. I don't think you knew it either. It came out on Netflix just in early April. Yeah. Favorite movie from the 80s. I don't know, probably Rocky 3. How about that?
I love Rocky 3.
We were talking about that at the dinner table this past Monday, just yesterday.
What's your favorite Rocky movie?
Good question. I really like the new Creed movies. I think they're great. So Creed and Creed 2, I both thought were fantastic. You can't enjoy Creed 2 without also being well versed in Rocky 4. And I think part of the reason why I enjoyed Creed 2 so much is because I am a Rocky fan. But yeah, if you were to truly say what's your favorite Rocky, I would have to say Rocky, the original, the very first one.
The original Rocky.
And it's not because I'm like, oh well, you can never improve on it. No, I think they're very different movies. I think they're all great. But the original Rocky movie has so many different layers, and whenever I've watched it at different times in my life, I've been inspired by different things in it. And so the first time I watched it, I was like, oh cool, boxing, and the second time I watched it, I was like, that's really cool how he's so persistent, and then 10 years after that I watched it, and it was like the love story between him and Adrian, and that's actually kind of where I am now, is that if I watch parts of it now, it's the love story between him and Adrian that really kind of inspires me and moves me. Yeah. Well, cousin,
it's so that's what a great film can do.
Absolutely. Well, I am looking forward to seeing you on stage again sometime soon, and whenever that happens, now that we've introduced you to all the folks who listen to the Most Pleasant Exhaustion podcast, we'll be sure to give you a promo then. But the thing that's bringing me joy, watching my cousin build his podcast here, and continue to live the dream as an actor and director. So thanks for being with me, buddy.
Thank you, Cousin George, and congratulations on Most Pleasant Exhaustion. I'm so proud of you, and I love you.
All right. Thanks, cousin. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
See you soon.